Thanks, Stefan. Thank you, everyone. So, to begin with, I was in Milan about a month ago, going to Munich for the Munich Security Conference. And I was sitting with a friend of mine who runs a top three Russian e-commerce company. And we were listening to the Croatian president speaking. And there was a line where she kind of made a conclusion that said Russia must stop meddling in democratic processes in the Balkans. And he burst out laughing. Mike Pence was there, half of the Pentagon. I asked him why was he laughing, and he said, well, it must be a 2016 speech they gave her, because it's the new paradigm. Russia meddles in U.S. elections, so Balkans is pretty much home territory. So with that in mind, I think it's fitting to start today with a quote by no other than Donald Rumsfeld, which essentially says the following: there are known knowns, and there are things that we know. There are known unknowns, and that is to say those are things that we know that we don't know. But the biggest challenge is the unknown unknowns, and that's something that we can't prepare for. So not a lot of people often quote Donald Rumsfeld, but it is a fitting quote because the times that we find ourselves in are really those of the unknowns, and the opportunities they hold, and how to actually tackle them. So, in that sense, I believe that these times and the context that we find ourselves in discussing geopolitically, and that's that of the Trump presidency, of a Twitter presidency, of Brexit, of perpetual EU crisis. It's a fitting one to discuss in this ironic context. So, for over 2 decades, the West was, for the most part, successful in tackling, managing, and preventing these unknown unknowns. Even if the unknown did present itself as a threat, it was in the form of known unknowns. It was managed, and it was dissolved. This was achieved through years of planning, preparation, pooling of resources, convergence. However, today, Europe finds itself facing existential challenges, and these are primarily existential challenges because they pose the unknown unknowns. From the war in Ukraine, Putin's and Russia's expansionist appetite, ethnic tensions in the Balkans, ongoing Russia, Turkey, EU disputes, and so on, we find ourselves in times that challenges that the European Union, for example, faces in terms of mass immigration, Islamic terrorism, radicalization. These are times that, for the past 25 years have become something of a lost memory. In the midst of this upheaval, the whole continent is faced with 2 major shifts. A Trump presidency and a U.S. ally that is no more, and a Brexit that only sets the example for a lot of motivated and inspired political movements, one of which is definitely a strong leader of those in Italy with the Cinque Stelle. In that sense, how should we interpret these messages? When the U.S. president says NATO is, should be scrapped, it's done with, we'll fight Iran, invade, China is going to get trashed. Should Europe be in fear of, American-U.S. disengagement in geopolitical hotpoints? Will NATO's Eastern Front be left unattended and undefended? What does Trump's America First policy really mean in the context of present geopolitical as well as economic understanding? In that sense, questions abound. Still, all might not be what it seems. Mr. Trump's harsh rhetoric so far amounts only to rhetoric. He has threatened to punish China for its currency devaluation. We see none of that. China is growing stronger and stronger. The top diplomat of the U.S. is essentially repeating their policy. We see threats of Iran deal being scrapped. Nothing happened yet. We hear that Russia is going to get a new deal with the U.S. The sanctions are going to be revoked. It's not happening. So in light of that, it's becoming a challenge, but also a craft to tell narrative and show from reality and from real policy. In that sense, the forces of globalization and the momentum that they have cannot and will likely not be halted by Mr. Trump and not by Mr. Putin. Emerging economies are growing fast. They're growing their momentum. They're developing their ecospheres and moving up the value chain. As they develop consolidated influence, those influences of the old powers, of the US, of the Russia, will wane. They might be followed by rhetoric that they will be made great again, that they will not be disallowed from what they deserve. However, the reality is different. In that sense, more integration poses more opportunities. In the midst of this global reshuffle, the European Union finds itself at a crossroad. While the threats are numerous and significant, the European project could benefit from the trials it is facing. In the current context, security is likely to become a driver of integration. Mr. Trump has signaled that a certain level of U.S. disengagement is likely to occur. That means Europe might finally become and start serving its own defense needs. Along with security, member states are also likely to support more integration as they secure better trade deals between themselves if they cannot count on those with others. As history has shown time and time again, challenging times are also characterized by the opportunities that follow in their wake. By assuming proactive roles, each can fend for themselves, but also tackle a bigger common goal. And with this in mind, I address some of the key concepts, how to tackle this new time of the unknown unknowns. The first one is exercising restraint. It is to recognize the opportunity not to do anything. Yeah. Figuring this out? Okay. So, in 2003, the U.S. States were very set politically and both economically to ramp up defense spending and invade Iraq. As they were trying to craft a coalition of allies that would essentially back them, that was still a time when the UN Security Council meant something. They were pressing allies to support the Iraq war and the war against Saddam Hussein, and the French were leading the no camp, trying to convince other European countries to essentially back off. The UK was on the other side of that aisle, and then as the US turned its attention to Latvia, Slovenia, Czech Republic, and the likes. Many have rallied to their cause. Many have committed between 5 and 15 soldiers altogether to support this U.S. effort. And so the U.S. and the international coalition was forged. In light of that, President Chirac gave a statement when the actual alliance was announced that some of these countries, these small countries, have missed an excellent opportunity to shut up. That is to say, they have not understood that not doing anything was the best opportunity for them at that moment. Those words remain a warning for all potential military interventionist disputes, which are likely to become more often and more tempting. Those involving breach of international law, ignoring the authority of the Security Council, international human rights, and so on. Restraint, adherence to law, European solidarity can be an effective bulwark against belligerence, warmongering, and divisionary discourse. The European project is a monument to such normative and rule-oriented decision-making, and more individualist movements, such as those of the 2003, are likely to yield rather than support effects of negative consequences. Unfortunately, Mr. Chirac's lesson is not lost on those who rushed to Mr. Trump's side in the midst of his verbal saber-rattling in front of China, Iran, and mostly North Korea. Only a united European Union is able and will be able to effectively project its interests beyond its borders. And for that matter, it must learn how to act and when not to act. The second concept is the virtue of moderation. It's a quality which, in election cycles and political momentums moderated by populism, radicalism, and generally a political discourse governed by the unplanned and the unseen, have all but vanished from Western political discourse. There's an increasing number of politicians, decision makers who act as though engaging in thought-out, discrete action is making them look weak. By assuming such positions, one confuses causes and outcomes. Namely, it was precisely the lack of responsibility for the spoken word that set up this stage for contemporary populism. The political profession, in general, is in need of restoration based on principles. In place of hysteria, verbal threats, there should come responsibility and moderation. Slander is and won't be the new normal because after the moment passes, repercussions will come, consequences will come, and tallies will be tallied. Whether we deal with opponents or critics, thought-out action is always preferable to the opposite. Nassim Taleb illustrates this in a very beautiful way, writing about the Sanjar, who became the Sultan of the Turkish Empire. Namely, when he rose to the top with thought-out political action, allies, murders, and so on, he was greeted the second day in the palace by a dagger stabbed next to him into his bed. That dagger was signed to have come from the assassins, which were an order of assassins that existed in ancient Turkey. And what that threat meant was it could have been in his head or his heart. However, it was next to his head. And it was a threat that words don't have to be spoken, but actions have to be taken so that threats would be real. In that sense, it was a warning sign that the Sultan governed with moderation and that he take those that can act against him seriously and that he takes threats seriously. It was a very successful relationship that the Sultan had with the assassins. However, the basic lesson of it was not lost. The third value is cultivating curiosity. Namely, fact-checking is not enough. Today there's a common misconception that the way people read and consume the news is prone to manipulation, to changing of facts for narratives and falsehoods. And after the Brexit referendum, when we famously heard that the British people have had enough of facts and enough of experts, and the Trump victory, which has effectively denied any relation to truths and realities of the economic, political, health, or any other science. A number of high-profile writers and commentators expressed concern that people were isolated in their ideological bubbles, surrounded by only people that perpetuate ideas and comments and stories that they themselves hold, and are not exposed to the other side, the alternative, to whatever the fact is, the opposite of it, to something that questions it. Due to this occurrence, experts claimed voters were unable to make informed choices, and something like Trump's victory could happen. While this categorization is useful to a certain extent, it excludes a large part of the real-world reality which surrounds us. Namely, there was an excellent study done last year which tried to prove and examine how people read news online and how these labels of right-wing or left-wing were actually formed in terms of news consumption and the sources and views that they reinforced. The authors of the study began with a sample of 1.2 million internet users, which should have been a really conclusive sample. But in the end, it dropped to only 50,000 people. The reason for that was that the rest did not read enough serious news to be included in such a study. The benchmark for being included was reading 10 articles in 3 months. The initial narrowing down of the sample speaks for itself. Fact-checking in the world is powerless when the general audience is not interested. In an age when half-truths and outright lies are openly used by politicians to create distractions, controversy, attract attention, audiences' attention must be focused on the precious resources. The stage upon which the battle for attention is fought is a crowded one. We are facing an inflation of media sources and an inflation of facts. In that sense, scientists and experts are now fighting for the audience's attention alongside TV, social networks, adverts, social media, and so on. The outcomes of the British referendum and the American presidential elections leave no doubt. Evidence and experts are not sufficiently effective, interesting, or influential at tackling fake news, post-fact epidemics. And is there anything that can tackle those? The FT's columnist, Tim Harford, claims, and I believe he's right, that the answer lies in cultivating scientific curiosity, namely not in countering what is told as wrongly stated facts and lies and fake truths, but rather pausing and inciting and challenging truths and challenging facts that are being misconceived and manipulated, and essentially trying to invoke curiosity and questioning. The same study that I talked about found that scientific curiosity and questioning trumped politically motivated reasoning, namely being able to incite and motivate readers to question what they're exposed to was more effective than any fact-checking website or agenda could have achieved. While scientifically literate people tend to end up being even more polarized in their politically ideological bubbles, the study showed that essentially by causing people to question what they're served rather than giving them the answer was more effective in bridging that ideological divide than any fact-checker could. In that sense, leaders who are able of recognizing opportunities in questioning the truths and questioning the ideas that are posed rather than presenting their own new ones are the ones that will be able to capture momentum and seize attention of the electorate. The fourth value and concept is staying vigilant. Vigilance is a general concept. However, in the context of geopolitical safety, health, security, it is one that is extremely important. In a tightly linked and interconnected world, risks multiply with opportunities, and risks come in all shapes and sizes. Regardless of what unilateralists, isolationists want us to believe, there is no border, no Mexico wall that can prevent and solve an epidemic. International diseases spread beyond borders, beyond mass migrations, and beyond any policy that can prevent it. The example of the Ebola epidemic is just an illustration of the devastating potential pathogens tend to spread. With the numbers being what they are, global health is now a matter of international security, more so than armed conflict. Ebola has spread all over the globe, from Sierra Leone and Liberia, at a shocking rate and a shocking speed. It is a moment and a narrative that we are hearing and seeing more and more. And as Bill Gates, always reminds us, deadly and fast-moving airborne pathogen is something that might kill 30 billion people in a year in the nearby future. And it's a narrative that is not being repeated by just him, but every essential scientific resource in this area. And although we haven't seen it yet, the Ebola pandemic was prevented and in the end did not reach its catastrophic dimension. It is something like in a script, when you're watching a movie and you see a gun, you're quite certain that somebody's going to get killed in the next frame, in the next scene. So in that sense, being worried today about it, for sure, tells us that this is a threat that will come tomorrow and will come at an excessively deadly rate. Scientists believe that there is reasonable probability we will experience such an outbreak in the next 2 decades. So it will take a tremendous unity and joint effort to overcome those devastating effects of such a catastrophe. Dealing with those challenges will not be unilateralist, a single country response. No international diplomatic or political deal will prevent a pandemic. So joint investment in health, fighting poverty, shared resources is the only way to prevent such a threat, rather than any barbed wire, border, or wall. The final concept that I come on is insisting on accountability, namely that words matter. With traditional assumptions of American foreign policy being questioned on a daily basis by Mr. Trump's Twitter account, it is easy to understand the bafflement that Europeans and international leaders face. Some have seized it, like the Japanese Prime Minister, who has rushed to his side. Some have cautiously watched from afar. A year ago, an article in the New York Times that said the leader of the free world visits the US president would have been unimaginable. However, it was the reality a few days ago only. The German Foreign Defense Minister reflected on this widespread European concern in a very well thought out manner. The EU remains unconvinced by the damage control the US administration is doing to moderate the policy that the president is dictating. In that sense, the only wise course of action is not belief that it is not real, that they will not act, that they don't mean to, go in a war in North Korea or essentially support Israel in a war against Syria or Lebanon, but rather prepare, plan, and act without anticipating support. We must plan ahead if we want to capture tomorrow's opportunities. In 10 years' time, the biggest 10 global technology companies will not be only American and will not be the same ones that they are today. Up-and-coming challengers will emerge from other parts of the world. Emerging economies will be home to over 4/5 of the world's population, and their economic development will allow them to dictate their own terms. Indeed, projections stating that they will overtake traditional economic powerhouses are already becoming commonplace and becoming real. Shifting of the board has already begun, and Europe would do well to position itself in a way which would allow it to capitalize on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity by the expanding power vacuum between two old powers and an evolving trade and changing political landscape with the emerging world. By assuming a proactive role in the events which are unfolding and by protecting its interests outside of its borders, the EU can hope to shape globalization rather than follow and leave a lasting imprint on future global economic relations. There is a lesson to be learned in the events which are unfolding across the Atlantic. President Trump will eventually be pressured into learning to appreciate a core principle of linguistics, diplomacy, and politics, that words are actions, and actions, especially those of political leaders, have consequences. They might not come today, they may not come tomorrow, but in 4 or 8 years, they are bound to come. When he questions the European Union or NATO, the world listens and reacts accordingly. The same is true for his odes to Russia, his comments on two-state solutions of Israel and Palestine, or his policy in China. Although the US might not follow through because of the terrible capacity for execution of this administration, the other side will. They will prepare, they will act, and they will come out of this, if they are ready and if they act in a thought-out manner, better prepared and in a better state than the one challenging them. A president's words are always on the record, and the world, in the end, always holds him accountable. While the campaign run-up to the presidency shielded Mr. Trump from this principle, almost every day of his mandate has been a painful reminder that the roles of candidate and president are rooted in different dimensions. The last several weeks taught Mr. Trump that his rhetoric can and will be used against his administration in court. His comments that his immigration ban is a Muslim ban in the end cost him 2 injunctions. His popularity is trickling down the drain. And as widespread, popular, expanded, bipartisan political backlash ensues after his attacks on the judiciary, on the free press, on the division of power, no one is exempt from the accountability which comes as part of holding public office. It might be delayed, but even Donald Trump will have his day in court. It was always and only just a matter of time. And while Mr. Trump and members of his administration choose to act as though political and social reality does not apply to them, the truth is, it does. And one only needs to look at the first few weeks in his time in office and learn that every blunder cost him more the next time. With that, credibility matters, and so they will learn. Truthfulness matters, and so they have learned. Reliability matters, they will soon learn. And in the end, words matter. They can send shockwaves, they can cause scandal, but in the end, they can also be a vehicle of stabilization and forging trust. In a time of populism and irresponsible political platforms, we should do well to remember that, and we should do well to remember the consequences that irresponsible words cause. As Mr. Trump will be held accountable for his words and actions by future generations, as every other administration has been, positively or negatively, Europe will also have to stand in front of a mirror and ask itself, how did we hold up in the face of adversity? Did we prepare for a post-crisis period? Did we see the signs when we were told we would not be supported, the EU will fall apart, NATO does not exist? Or are we blinded by the whirlwind of current events and expect someone else to solve them? Allow me to conclude my presentation with the words of another US president, which has been and will likely be judged more favorably by the events and times that have followed him, John Kennedy. Change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past and present will certainly miss the future. Thank you.